Dear viewers, thank you for joining us to discuss something that is so timely and important, Armenia-Diaspora Unity. Today, I'll be joined by Drs. Kotchikian and Gevorkyan to discuss about challenges and opportunities in Armenia-Diaspora relationships. Dr. Asbed Kotchikian is a repatriated professor at American University of Armenia Political Science Department, and Dr. Aleksandr Gevorkyan is a Henry George Chair in Economics and Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Finance at St. John's University. Dr. Gevorkyan is the author of book, Transition Economists, Transformation, Development, and Society in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me. I'm hoping for an active and healthy discussions about diaspora-Armenia relationships. As Albert Hirschman once noted, development is not so much about allocation of existing resources, but rather about mobilizing resources that are hidden, scattered, or badly utilized. Armenia's main resource is not copper or molybdenum or any other natural resource, but rather its people that reside within and outside of the borders of Armenia. So for decades, diaspora has been viewed more like an extractive resource. A major contribution that the diaspora could have made has not happened because of a number of reasons. So would you please discuss briefly the challenges we face in terms of Armenia diaspora, financial and non-financial ties, or generally speaking, in terms of Armenia diaspora relationships? What are the challenges, and more importantly, what are the opportunities? What are the areas that could be improved? Alek?
Okay, I was hoping you would ask Asbed first, but thank you. Thank you very much, Yeva, for inviting us, for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be joining as a co-panelist with you and Asbed, and also on this platform, the Future Armenian, which clearly is very important. Your question is very complex, I should say. I knew the idea of our discussion, but I thought we could have more of a spontaneous sort of a brainstorm session. So the challenges are simple and monumental at the same time. And maybe in the introduction or sort of the beginning of the event, we should probably, I'll try to keep it short, but the simple one is the connection, right? Is there a connection, and what type of the connection is there between diaspora and Armenia? But also the other way around, and hopefully that's the question we can come back to towards the as we go on with the discussion, but it's the other side of Armenia and diaspora. So that's a simple question, it seems, because if any one of us talks to our non-Armenian friends, the perception is that, look, we're omnipresent and there's this massive support network out there. At the same time, the monumental part is that the connection is very nuanced, complex, very individual based, and not often is as sustainable as we would like it to be. And I'm sure, so I think Asbed might contribute more even to this, but we seem to react better in times of crisis, a topic which has, and a point that has been brought up in many other conversations. And we seem to be sort of assuming the status quo of this relationship, this diaspora and Armenia relationship, in times of perceived stability. And I try to choose my words carefully. Things seem to be going well, and there's no need to put any extra effort into this. And again, this could be justifiable view. Okay, so why not? Yeah, you just need to focus on building your life and your families and so on. The rest will take care of itself. But it turns out, as we've learned, at least over the past 30 years, right? And of course, the topic of diaspora and research goes deep with its roots into the history and in general. But over the past 30 years is at least that it's continuous work. And it's almost like every little step is a little tiny brick in constructing this system, a framework of or diaspora engagement infrastructure between the two entities. But I should probably yield to Asbed's points now.
Okay, thanks, Alec. I was going to say that because Yeva asked about the financial and the non-financial component, I think it's within the more your purview, but to talk about financial components, we can revisit that. And I intentionally and consciously, and so that I don't look uninformed, I'm not going to mention anything which I am uninformed about the financial components or the financial aspect of this. As Alec mentioned, we're talking about a multi-nuanced and multi-vector sort of relations. It's almost a cliche. We say this constantly. First of all, I think the first issue that maybe in the way of answering your question, I will ask more questions. After all, this is the teaching method that most professors do. It's also a way to avoid answers, but it's not. I think these are useful questions that we need to think about. First of all, when we talk about the diaspora, who is a diasporan? We have to ask ourselves, who is a diasporan? I'm not going to go into the details. There's academic work about what constitutes a diaspora, who's a diasporan, and so on and so forth. Suffice it to say that a diasporan is anyone who feels that they're a diasporan, right? If they've been living outside of Armenia for 5 generations, or they just moved out of Armenia. Okay, or the homeland. This is something I think we can talk about later, because that's also a figure. There's an image as to what constitutes Armenia or homeland. A second issue, I think, when it comes to the assessment of diaspora-Armenia relations, and Alec put it very good way, I think, it's a diaspora Armenia, Armenia-Diaspora. With one caveat, I would say diasporas rather than diaspora. I insist on calling it diasporas because it's not one superarching entity. It has all the layers involved there. So the next question would be, so who speaks on behalf of the diaspora, right? When it comes to a country, whether you like it or not, whether it's legitimate or not, there is a government that speaks on behalf of the state. But who speaks on behalf of the diaspora? In our context, usually in Armenian context, it is always about the major organized institutions, be that affiliated with political parties, the church, various clubs, and so on and so forth, associations, and so on and so forth, which renders our exercise here is a bit more complicated. Do we look at organized diaspora versus Armenia relations, or we're talking about diaspora in general? What about individuals? By various accounts, the amount of, or the percentage of Armenians in the diaspora who are one way or another affiliated with organized institutions, let's call it, is not more than 40%. The number goes up and down. This is a very generous estimate. Again, there's no data on this, but it is an estimate based on my experience having lived in 60 different countries, visited the 60 different countries on different research and so on. You can see the norm is that individuals are outside of institutions than others. So this is important to understand because when you're assessing, Yeva, you mentioned that it hasn't yielded results as we see, but how do you measure results? If an average Armen visiting a diasporan Armen visiting Armenia and starting a project, which could have a significant impact on a small community versus a big organization that invests millions or sometimes hundreds of and tens of millions, how do you assess? How do you give that assessment? Now, a big challenge has been, I think, mutual misunderstanding. I think there has always been a misunderstanding on behalf of the diasporans, most diasporans, and I'm overgeneralizing here, about what is Armenia. And by Armenia, individuals in Armenia, I'm calling it, see, even the language is not trained for this. Armenians who live in Armenia, about what is the diaspora. I've observed this for the last 30 years in my multiple visits in Armenia, and I've seen that people in Armenia at least have better understanding of what is a diaspora. Not a good understanding, but better than it was. I think this is also because of the fact that you have interactions happening. Armenians in Armenia are more exposed to diasporans than diasporans are to Armenia. And we have to be candid, coming to Armenia for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even for 4 months, and more often than not living in a bubble, more often than not. And again, I don't want to generalize. And unlike Alec, I'm probably not going to choose my words carefully. But I think that perceptions actually have been changing more in Armenia than in the diaspora. And this is a challenge. And you see all these stereotypes here, all these stereotypes, be that about doing business in Armenia, about, oh, I'm not going to go and live in Armenia, but if I die, I'm going to go and be buried there, as if Armenia is a big cemetery, right? You know, it's nothing more than a cemetery for that homeland or, you know, patriotic feeling and so on. So I think generational issue is also a factor. I think more and more younger diasporans have a real connection rather than an imagined connections with Armenia. And that is developing to become a critical mass. And that's something to be looked at more closely and, you know, help break those stereotypes and release the bubbles or live outside of the bubbles. I think in order to achieve or understand or even evaluate what could be done and so on, first of all, we need to understand what is. How are the perceptions? Why do Armenians choose to invest in Armenia versus somewhere else, for instance? Why do you choose to come to Armenia for, you know, 2 months in the summer rather than go to, I don't know, Haiti, well, not Haiti, Cuba or the Bahamas or, you know, somewhere else, Italy or Greece? You know, maybe there is an emotional component that we need to also address. But these are some of my initial thoughts about what have been the challenges so far and what is the direction that we need to be going in.
Thank you so much for your insights. Actually, now we're coming more towards the brainstorming part of the discussion, Alec. And this follow-up question is going to be more like more following what Asbed actually mentioned. As you mentioned, we face a number of issues in diaspora-Armenia relationships. So let's talk about the very thing that is at the heart of diaspora-Armenia relationships and makes any type of cooperation, if you will, between diaspora and Armenia desirable in the first place. That is our Armenian identity. So I do believe that it is Armenian identity that connects us, makes the foreign direct investment of Armenian origin in Armenia possible, that brings philanthropy, brings repatriation to Armenia or any other types of financial or non-financial ties with Armenia possible. In fact, a study conducted in early 2000 highlighted that 71% of Armenian-born diaspora investors and 87% for diaspora-born investors mentioned ethnic identity as the motivation to invest in Armenia. So Dr. Kotchikian, as a repatriated professor who has written and talked about diaspora-Armenia relationships and identity, I'll start with you. One of the problems is that we do not have that focal point as, let's say, Jews have. For thousands of years, Jews had that focal point, a physical place, with the idea of a memory of Jerusalem to go back to. Perhaps there was a place that is located in a nowadays Israel. And that's perhaps why when asked what it means to be a Jew, 43% of American Jews answered care for Israel. At the same time, the Armenian people rarely associated the dreams and aspirations with a return to some physical place that would be located in current-day Armenia. So maybe that was why when asked what it means to be Armenian, and granted those surveys were done differently, the majority responded that it is the keeping the memory of genocide, speaking the language, cooking Armenian food, and listening to Armenian music. So the question is, how do we start cultivating that identity? Let's start brainstorming, right? Connecting Armenian identity to Armenia, so that whenever I say I'm Armenian on a subconscious level, I immediately imply that I am Armenia. What do you think the challenges and opportunities are relating to cultivating Armenian identity, and what could be done? And what could be the role of, let's say, digital platforms, current technologies, some modern trends in cultivating Armenian identity and building that emotional citizenship amongst diasporans of different generations? The floor is yours.
It's a good point, Yeva, that you mentioned about how is identity defined. You know, Ernest Renan, a French philosopher, thinker, in 1882, he gave a speech in Sorbonne titled, "What is a Nation?" And one quote that I use a lot in defining this component is that when it comes, suffering in common unifies people more than joy does. when national memories and national identity is concerned, griefs are of more value than triumphs, for they impose duties, they impose and require common effort. So from this perspective, I think it is I think it's not unexpected that Armenian identity is based on the trauma of the genocide, right, and subsequent genocide, tragedies, be that the earthquake and so on and so forth. And now you have the war. But again, the genocide is so encompassing that even people in Armenia would allocate to that. One thing I would disagree with you is about the premise of the question and the comparison with the Jewish experience, right? The reason for this is very simple. Israel was the creation of its diaspora. Armenia is not the creation of its diaspora. If anything, in 1991, when Armenia became independent, to paraphrase someone that mentioned this before, it's like it was the best news that ever the Armenian diaspora would have that had no impact whatsoever on its daily life. Okay, so it was a great news, but it didn't change much of their lives. The institutions continued, the struggles continued. And from this perspective, I think there's another layer that makes it impossible to, or makes it difficult, let's not call it impossible, to have an identity, common identity, is when you talk about, when you say Armenia, or when you say homeland, right, or when you say country name, right, Israel versus homeland, they are synonymous. But when you say Armenia and you say homeland, they are not synonymous. Even the word Armenia is not, means different things. I met people in the United States who would say, oh, in the old country, they've been here for 4 or 5 generations. In the old country where we had this, and then I say, where's the old country? I said, Kharpe. Okay, but well, you have no freaking connection with it. You might have, it's what you have heard and so on and so forth. But you have that element. So Armenia can be the historic land. Because don't forget, identities are formed based on family, right? So if your family comes from Van or comes from, even in Armenia, right? When you talk with people, sometimes they would say, yeah, my ancestors were from Mush. Like they have that connection to something that is not, it's an imagined connection, granted, but it is a connection. So how do you reconcile, or how do you bring the idea of a homeland and Armenia and superimpose and create that? I think you shouldn't. I think we shouldn't do that. I think it has to have a natural flow. It has to have a natural sort of connection. And I think, as I said earlier, it's about coming and experiencing the land of Armenia, the country of Armenia, that creates that link, that creates that real connection, physical connection. It's about the land. It's about, the country, this and that, even the clubs for the young people, right? It's like going out and the pubs and so on and so forth. That's a real connection that they would associate with Armenia. And I think that issue is a generational one. But I'm sorry to take take it away from you, but I do want to ask a question about something that has been bothering me to Alec, in a way to pass it on to him as well. But for me, it's also interesting, to what extent can an emotional connection to the land be an incentive for people to invest? Is it something that, you invest based on your emotions, that I want to invest in the country? I have 10, 15, 20 million dollars I want to invest. Do you do that based on the best business practices or the returns? Or there is a national or ethnic affinity that does that to you?
Okay, let me try to build up to answering this. Thanks for the question. But Yeva's point on identity is so profound. It's and Asbed, you touched on the complexities of it, and it made me, and I looked a little bit dreamy because I was actually thinking about what you were saying and digesting it, because it seems to me it's not a simple thing that sort of goes away somehow magically if we figure out, like in this session we figure out a recipe and here it is, it works for everyone. What you refer to as the diaspora is this sort of dispersion, right? We disperse because it's actually the term diaspora, and that's how we are. And even studying Armenian diaspora, going back in history, kind of even the merchant networks that were sustained, and Sepu Aslanyan's wonderful book kind of explains this. It shows how people maintain their identity of certain type, even within the Armenian world of specific origin and such. but it gradually becomes either they either assimilate or it gets destroyed, or one way or another, it just disappears. So the challenge then comes on, well, how do we sustain this if that's the point? By the way, we have to decide if that's the main idea. And now I'm coming to your question. And several countries figured out how to do this, and not the obvious example that Armenians usually jump to. But for example, if you take Ireland, with whom I'm acquainted through my professional work in many ways, but also recently we had a session at the Armenian Economic Association with the Networking Institute out of Ireland. Reading up about Ireland's steps made me think about it, because yes, there is an effort to draw more business people and investments into Ireland from the rest of the world, global Irish. But there's also something that is very centralized, and that's coming out of the government. The government of Ireland supports cultural and educational projects across the world, providing concrete, specific funding to organizations that would like to set up an Irish Day, St. Patrick's Day, somewhere in the depths of pick your country, not to name anyone, right? So any country. So that sort of helps to sustain this cultural connection, and also is not that simple. You know, Ireland is relatively big, and there are also sort of allegiances, affiliations to specific areas, and people remember fondly where their families are from and such. But the idea is that you maintain this general idea of what adds up into this, what we call identity, right? And it sustains it. What we have in the Armenian world is probably the financial resources that are not so much significant, but we have a network of organizations, right? And that is what I think, to me, that's where in the diaspora organizations, and this is where I think sort of not the burden, but the responsibility is to maintain this, but in connection to Asbed, what you were saying, in connection with a country called Armenia. Because if someone goes out there and self-identifies themselves as Armenian, then, well, what do you connect with? What is the anchor for you, right? And that's important. How this translates into investment, this is not an overnight process. This is another thing. Economic development is rarely simply about increasing GDP or whatever metrics you would like to think about it. It also involves social development, institutional development, of course. Simply speaking, it's how you feel as a resident of a location X living in that location. Do you feel yourself accomplished or not? It brings up another problem as well, because we tend to think about development as individual based in economics. So if we talk about, I talk to students about this capabilities, you have to feel free to choose, to free to choose how to live and access to healthcare and things like this. But this individuality has to translate into something of a common good. Okay, now, how to put all this together? I think sustaining this emotional connection, cultural connection, goes a long way to build towards more concrete path for, well, we use the term investment, but really engaging with the country, because it's not necessarily just transferring money. It could just be, I mean, there are many examples in Armenia right now, by the way. We should not be complaining, by the way, right? I mean, the whole wine industry, or, and let's just focus on positive results. The wineries, right? Or what else do I know? IT sector, right? Which cross borders that are not as tangible borders, right? That's more out there in the open. So I think that's important. Now, as far as IT sector, everybody wants to become either South Korea or India, or at least in casual conversations. We should remember that in the case of India, it was really sort of, it started as it was a push factor, right, out of Silicon Valley, that people who reached managerial positions realized that they had access and connection with the labor force, which was relatively well suited in terms of education, background, and so on. Somewhere
English language being there, you know, they didn't have to have English language problems.
English language and so on, right? labor force which is also disciplined in terms of organizational matters, right? So here's the job, here we're working. And this is quite important. Maybe it's uncomfortable talking about this, but you go from any of the Asian countries that are successful or people bring up as examples, and you find these common features. But in any case, and it's the movement of some of the production or tasks to India that started, that helped the local IT sector to grow. And then only after that, the government realized that there was a potential. And only after that, the connection between the government, the country of India, let's put it this way, the country of India and what's now known as non-resident Indians has become more formalized and opened up in terms of financial processes through the attempts with the diaspora bonds, but which worked, but then were transformed into more meaningful, I think, banking connections. In other words, somebody working in the Silicon Valley now can maintain accounts in India, help their family, and so on. The only problem that remains is that there's no supersonic jet that will cut on travel time. Which, by the way, this separation, physical separation, is very important, right? And so hopefully our Zoom sessions are helping to bring people actually closer to each other.
Yeah.
Yeva, may I just, I just want to add one thing about identity. You know, one of the other things about being and feeling Armenian is that diasporans, or some diasporans probably, and again, I can't assume to speak on behalf of anyone, and I don't, is that, you know, it's about the idea of multiple identities. One of the things that triggered this is when you said, you know, I'm a repatriated professor and so on. I don't see myself as a repat. You know, I happen to be in Armenia. I live there, I work there, and so on. But repatriation is such a heavy word. It comes with so much, baggage and so on. It's about having multiple identities. I am, you know, I remember one of my first interactions with students in Armenia when I was teaching there in 2000 was when someone asked me, "Are you Armenian?" And I said, "Sometimes." And she couldn't figure out what that means. I said, well, I am Armenian, I am Lebanese, I am American, I am, you know, a friend, I am this and that. You know, it's not just about ethnic identity. So we don't need to have that. Just like as I said earlier, that a diasporan is whoever who thinks that she or he is a diasporan. The same thing with Armenian. Why do we need to have a matrix in a way that you have to have at least half the parent, like one of the parents being Armenian, or you have to speak some Armenian, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the key challenges. And Alex, the reason why I also was listening intently to Alex's explanation is that I remember in 1991, there were so many Armenians who came to Armenia and opened up, franchises even. I remember there was the first Benetton sort of a franchise opened in Yerevan by a diasporan Armenian, but then of course it was more emotionally driven rather than investment driven, and they closed it down, you know, a year later or so. But you know, there is that component. You know, you feel comfortable. It goes back to the stereotypes, right? I heard it so many places. Oh, there are thieves there, or they're this, and so on. And I say, have you been? No, but I know someone who's no. Yes, I know someone who knows someone who knows someone. Like 6 degrees of separation, you're always going to find something bad. So I think it's a combo of that, about the real sort of connection and the real understanding of what is Armenia. What is the investment mood? What is the society like? Armenia is not just Yerevan, right? We talk about all of this. You know, what about Gyumri? You know, what about, Vanatsor? What about other places, right? But people, especially from a diasporan perspective, it's Yerevan, and, you know, it's set, at least in most cases. But I guess, I'll shut up now.
But I agree, and it's hard not to step in. I'm sorry, Eva.
No. That's why it is discussion. I said that we are kind of going to brainstorm. We have some questions, but we might cover or might not cover.
I mean, a couple of things that, number one, with this whole repat, sure, I understand the need for the use of the term, but really it's real for anyone who's moving to Armenia permanently. For a long term, it's immigration with all its cultural shocks and all of things to be expected. What surprises me about, sort of through anecdotal conversations, but now we have surveys out there that also kind of point to this fact, is that how much is expected by a diasporan from Armenia before they make a move or before they invest. They ask for guarantees that their investment will grow. I don't know if there's a country where this guarantee can be promised. Why? If you are running a business, you are taking a risk by definition. It's just, you know, the tones of the risk, as they say, the shades of the risk are different, but that's the whole point. The higher the risk, the greater is the reward. Now, what is the reward for you? If you're trying to open a business in Armenia, it's probably monetary reward, but also probably some type of self-fulfillment. In fact, several years ago at the Diaspora Forum, in the business session, and I was just attending as someone who was listening and learning from things, but quite successful business people from the diaspora, from across the world, pretty much stated it bluntly. They said, listen, we made all the money in the world. Don't sell us a project about making the money. We want to have a project that will have a meaningful impact on development, right?
Yeah. That's a great point, actually. That kind of resonates with initially what I said about 71% of Armenian-born diaspora investors and 87% of diaspora-born investors. And it is an important number. 87% of diaspora-born investors mention ethnic identity as motivation to invest in Armenia. It's quite a big number. And if you think about this, diaspora-born investors, they have all the possibilities, right, in the world. Like if I'm opening a manufacturing, I could go to Vietnam. Let's say China is more expensive to produce. I go to Vietnam to invest. The only thing that would motivate really me to choose Armenia versus Georgia, even in a region versus Georgia, Azerbaijan, or any other country, is because I have Armenian heritage. I have that Armenian identity, as you mentioned, like many of identity, like kind of in my salad bowl, in my salad bowl of identities, I have that Armenian ingredient, whatever, that is kind of somewhat dominating, not too recessive for me to choose to go to invest in Armenia, right?
And
Alec, I'm sorry, I kind of interrupted you. Go
ahead. Go ahead, Alec. You wanted to say?
Oh, no, I'm fine. I'm okay with listening.
Well, it's always about learning, right? But also what you mentioned, Alec, about the issue of expectations, right? As an investor, what do you expect? But it's also about people who move to Armenia, immigrate to Armenia, let's say. They also have expectation, and sometimes it's not real. I have to, again, I'm generalizing here, but more often than not, I have seen this. And I have been living in Armenia back and forth. I haven't lost touch and so on, even if I've just moved there permanently, immigrated there permanently. But there's always that, how should I put it? The snobbiness, basically, even a neo-colonial attitude. You see people, diasporans coming in and, sitting at a cafe or complaining about service. And you ask, for freaking sake, do you have the same kind of service, the service that you expect in Armenia? Do you have that service in the country that you're coming from?
I was going to say,
why
we're
do
on
you
the air.
Yeah, that's why I had to, we can't bleep this out, but I was careful. See,
I agree.
But see, that's the expectation, right? Or if I have children, I want to move. What are the schools like? Is there anything that, I can expect that my kids are going to get the education that will bring them eventually to a college in the United States, right? So all of these, it's about managing expectations.
But what's really not surprising, I don't really know how to characterize it, but it is a fact that the conversation that we're having is very similar to conversations people that were having 10 years ago, and I remember 20 years ago. People complaining about long lines and waiting lines at the post office or somewhere else, and people jumping lines. Well, come to the city where I am. I'll show you how that's done by non-Armenians. And I mean, that's not really the issue to be discussing. Okay. Yeah. I think the problem, though, with or rather what these isolated examples uncover is that living in the diaspora, people have this idealized view of Armenia, right? They expect Armenia to welcome them, to be this perfect sort of a type of something, perfect diamond or whatever you want to compare it with. that is flawless, and it is just good, in some cases to visit, or if you're thinking about moving permanently, you don't expect to encounter any problems. But unfortunately, the thing is, it's a living society with all its faults and good sides. It's getting that probably and for diaspora, accepting that reality is one of the challenges, because subconsciously there's always something else to compare, a stable lifestyle somewhere else. And we're generalizing, by the way. Of course, not every diasporan Armenian lives in a comfortable lifestyle, but generally speaking. So this macro environment also matters now in economic terms, sort of the macro environment in which one finds himself or herself is important as well. And whether you feel it's all up to you and you left by yourself with your problems, or there's some type of a support mechanism. In this case, by the way, all these groups on Facebook are very helpful, I think, for repatriates, because people just post a question and there's the feeling of a community. But it brings up the next problem. I'm sorry, there's no way to stop here. The next problem is that this community becomes isolated as a group. And where's the real connection with people, as you mentioned? It's not just Yerevan, right? But beyond, especially in the villages. And I mean, when I travel, people ask me, pointing at someone riding a bicycle on the roads between Sisyan and Goris, and asking, what's wrong with this guy? Why is he riding a bicycle?
Yeah. But things have also been also changing in the sense that, it's real. It's like, it's not giving, there's this whole thing. It's not about investment. It's about smart investment, or it's not about just giving. It's about smart giving. And there are examples, as you mentioned, and we can talk about the bad things, but we need to also realize that there have been cases where individuals have actually made an impact, or projects have made an impact, right? Either through international NGOs,
yes.
The wine industry that you mentioned, Alec, there's the hospitality business, that has changed.
Right, the carpets, the
carpet, and we don't really,
yeah,
exactly. But also the other thing is not by choice. In the recent years, Syrian refugees, Syrian Armenian refugees coming to Armenia. It's amazing how the hospitality business, the service industry, and the food industry in Armenia, in Yerevan, the landscape changed dramatically. Because you have suddenly 10, 12,000 people, they're working, they bring in the Middle Eastern or the Mediterranean culture of food, but also the service and so on and so forth. And people are learning from them. So they do realize that being nice to a customer, you will get, instead of not getting any tip, it's getting, I don't know, a 2,000 dirham tip. So people do, that has all these impact, the rolling impact. And the identity, the issue of going back to the issue of identity and, thinking about Armenia in a real way, I've always wondered about this, that Armenia's independence was the perfect opportunity for the diaspora to re-examine itself. There is no fear of assimilation. There is the fear of assimilation, yes, but now you have an independent Armenia that you can connect to and negotiate your identity, and you can think about how to get things differently and so on. But the diaspora never did that. And I think that has been the major challenge overall. And diaspora has maintained a similarity or overlap between what is real and what is ritualistic. The diaspora, they did not make that distinction, or hasn't made that distinction at a large scale. Again, generalization, but this is one of the key aspects. And because of that, the diaspora hasn't been renewing. Diaspora, the meaning of diaspora and the engagement of diaspora hasn't been changing in the space, in the pace that it needs to. I think that this lack of distinction between what is real, Armenia with its old problems and advantages, and what is imagined, ritualistic, Armenia with Mount Ararat and the Sosyat trees and this and that, and like, okay, we get it, but you have a real Armenia that you can connect to. You can have a emotional and physical connection with.
And exactly, and this could go both ways. If I just make very quickly, yeah, this could go both ways. One is you actually connect, and the other is you actually turn away. But this is why the work of, let's say, so from what I know, let's say Repat Armenia, Birthright Armenia, and others who are sort of bringing people for short term. Here's the sort of this cultural immersion or long term is so much important. because that what really allows one to test drive whether or not this is for you. And then it may not there may not be immediate result. The individual might go back and eventually then return. So,
and this is the job of the state, right? To create those environment, to create those, not environment. And I'm very much against to, treat the immigrant, for the lack of any other word, the repat Armenians, treat them differently, but create an environment where, I would like to go back. And this also goes back to the lack of understanding. Even in Armenia, we still have at an institutional level, there is no understanding as to what is a diasporan, what would a diasporan think about. They have made some cases here and there, like make it easy for someone who's repatriating for the first time to bring in their household stuff. And so these are small things, but there are so many other things that one has to consider without creating a distinction between the diasporans being treated differently than the citizen of Armenia or the or hayastansi, sort of the local hayastansi.
The code phrase I use is engagement infrastructure. In other words, what's been put in place, what programs, and those could be very simple ones. Again, the cultural, what Ireland is doing is great, or the academic programs. For example, Greece has a Fulbright program to bring individuals, young scholars, back and forth.
Well, AGBU really established American University of Armenia. So
yes, but we're talking
about, was established by diasporans. They bring people in, but also that engagement from diaspora's end is not as active as it used to be.
This is the thing. Yes, Yeva, you're absolutely correct. There are all these things in place and nobody's denying them. They're massive successes. They've taken massive effort and sacrifices. The question is in continuing it, sustaining that, right? And that's
so, okay. So that I really wanted to go towards opportunity perspective, right? Like, because we know a lot of examples that where identity really brings tangible results. Whether we talk about Chinese diaspora, 80% of investors in China are actually of Chinese origin because they know language, they know how to do it, things, etc. So that identity, in a way, can bring tangible or intangible results, just like you both mentioned. And we, in our Armenian case, we see a lot of philanthropy coming to Armenia, which is because of identity. Why would you donate your money to Armenia if you are not, like, kind of like, if it is not about your identity, if you don't want to Armenia to prosper, or like in telethons we see, like during the wars or the natural disasters, or even in 2008 crisis, we see a spike of donations on a telethon organized by Armenia Fund, because people want their compatriots or people who you are emotionally linked to do better, right? Remittances are another kind of example of Armenian identity, and foreign direct investments. And given the current situation in Armenia, we all want to kind of see that the participation of diaspora is more engaged, diaspora is more engaged, diaspora participates more in Armenian development processes, just because without diaspora, at least I see it this way, that Armenia is not going to be able to prosper without diaspora's help, right? Because if you're a foreign investor of not Armenian origin, you have a lot of options where to invest, correct? And like first mover, for the most part, whether we're talking about China, we're talking about Ireland, we're talking about Scotland, we know the global Scot, that they try to attract their diaspora investors. We talk about Israel, we talk about even like African countries. It's all diaspora that is first mover, investor, and then it brings other diaspora network, their friends or others start being interested in the country and investing. So Asbed mentioned something that kind of set up good ground for my next question. So there are potentially many untapped financial and human resources in diaspora, but potential is not always actual or available, right? Yes, the diaspora is invaluable and fundamental resource for the economic, social, and political development of Armenia. At the same time, there is a considerable gap between that, as I mentioned, massive humanitarian contribution of the diaspora and its much modest participation in Armenian economic life, whether we're talking about foreign direct investments, whether we're talking about repatriation, which Armenia really needs, the skill set, that new way of thinking and new kind of that fresh air, right? Like the boost in thinking way, knowledge, the skills that can transfer and do things differently. To make the potential actual, Asbed mentioned, Armenian state needs to take, to show the leadership. Maybe I believe that both homeland and diaspora actually need to show leadership. So my question is, how do we motivate diaspora to be engaged in the development processes of Armenia? How do we show to the diaspora that is going through a serious crisis itself and that it needs prosperous Armenia every bit as much as and needs to become more active in the processes of development? So Asbed mentioned something about assimilation. So I'm going to ask this question: should Armenia approach the question of motivating diaspora from an identity perspective, from a national pride perspective? Should it approach it from the classic diaspora sphere of assimilation perspective, from a security provision perspective, such that, hey, diaspora, just like you mentioned, Syrian refugees, whenever there is something man-made or natural disaster in a country where you reside, you can always view Armenia as a place to escape to, or maybe Armenia should seek or adapt a completely different approach. What do you think? How do we reach this shared understanding that both parties need each other, and the prosperity of Armenia and prosperity of diaspora are quite linked?
Yeah, you know, when you say, should we do this, do that, so on, and my answer is yes. You know, we're talking about a big entity. We're talking about state and government. They can work on several projects. So as organization, it's not that we have one individual who has to think about 10 different things. So that's one. I think, as Alec mentioned, it's about the engagement infrastructure, which is the job of the state to create. But lest we forget that Armenia 20 years ago or 10 years ago is not the Armenia of today. And I'm not talking about the war, but overall the human resource that Armenia itself has. Being in education, in higher ed, for instance, I have observed in the last 25 years about how Armenia's higher education, in terms of producing researchers, teachers, and so on, has exponentially increased and developed. Right? Yet we still have some aspects of people saying, oh, they don't know how to do things, again, from the diasporan perspective. But if anything, I think this the 2020 war motivated, and I've been seeing this more and more, is the collaboration. So it's not about engagement anymore. It's about collaboration, be that academics working with other academics in diasporan academics working with our academics in Armenia, be that professionals doing the same thing. And this is actually the norm. That should be the norm, rather than, oh, I am a professor of so-and-so, I'm going to come and teach you what to do. But no, there are people already in Armenia that are able to do that. They might not have access to the resources, or that you as a diasporan scholar might have, or a professional might have, but that doesn't mean that they are not well prepared. So I think focusing on sort of the sectoral sort of interactions, like health system. I know people, Armenian Medical Association, you know, they come in, they organize, and it's not about just sending medicine. They come into Armenia, they work with the Yerevan State University for Medical University to give lectures and so on. There's those who come in and do surgeries and teach the people or interact with people and learn from them as well. So I think it's about, when it comes to the real engagement, as we kept saying, I think to a large extent, the approach should also be collaborative work, collaboration, and a lot of research, social sciences, right? A lot of people don't care about social sciences, but I need to do a research about something, an event or a phenomenon in Armenia. As much as I'm trained, as much as I can speak the language, when I go there, if I have a partner, a co-researcher who actually knows the landscape, the social nuances better than me, can you imagine how much better my research would be? And this is happening. It's just a matter of increasing this, or it's just a matter of increasing the intensity and the frequency of these things. And that's, I think, what should be approached, what should be done in general.
That's exactly my question. How do we do that?
It all comes from the center.
Yeah, go ahead.
It all comes from the country, right? It has to be. This is what, if we are to copy anyone's example, their only consistent example is that from Ireland to India to China to Moldova, whichever one, there's a central agency that does this work. And it connects in a non-political way, by the way, but in more of informational. Here's a country, you like it, visit, here's what you can learn, and these are the opportunities you can connect with. So that's what's has to be developed. And to some extent, again, Armenia has achieved great strides because the achievements that we have are really individually driven achievements that we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So what you're saying pretty much that, hey, let's have an like networks, institutions set up that could be state plus NGOs or state plus private, that would help us to that would create this ground, this whatever, whether it's a digital platform or in whatever form it is, that kind of with collaboration of these NGOs from diaspora, from Armenia and state, we can build these networks of, well, let's say starting a business entity, or what networks of professionals to connect to Armenia and give this opportunity, this platform for people to connect. Is that, do I understand it correct? That's what you're saying?
Something like that. Ethnic Armenian living in Greenland, discovering that he or she is ethnic Armenian and just wants to say, what can I do? They go on the web and say, what can I do as an Armenian? And it should bring them to this, what I call digital portal, and then help them figure out, well, here are the opportunities. And by the way, I want to connect with the question we have in the chat. I don't know if you noticed this, but there's one question about Armenia's membership in the Eurasian Economic Union and whether or not that can serve as a gateway to non-member countries in a similar way as Ireland did for European Union. And I think that is something to consider from purely economic perspective. And this is the question, of course, it comes with all sorts of other limitations, but for a large group of diaspora investors or business people, this could be an opportunity to explore.
Okay.
And it's the synergy, right? It doesn't have to be organized. I mean, the state has to create those infrastructures, but the mechanisms as well. But again, we're living in a world that we do not need to have those. It's so easy to set up, those connections. And, as I said, academically speaking, in different disciplines like economics, political science, sociology, anthropology, and so on, it's so easy to make connections with scholars or people in your field and, work collaboratively. And just for the sake of example, one of the discussions I had a couple of years ago with a diasporan about wanting to set up a research center in the diaspora about researching Armenia, I said, listen, you're going to be spending a couple of $100,000. Probably the salary of the researchers there is going to be not less than $50,000 a year. But, you can have the same center in Armenia with a supervisor or with collaboration with a fraction of that cost. It's exploitation probably, because Armenia of 1990, or even 2000 or even 2010 is not the Armenia of 2021, right? We do have those people. I'm amazed. I'm amazed with the knowledge of colleagues that I knew, former students that I had in Armenia back in 2000, be that at Yerevan State University, at Brusov, in Gyumri, at AUA even. They have the potential. It's not just about the responsibility of the diaspora to come and teach, come and help, and so on. It's also for the diasporan to benefit from it. So it's also another marketing thing, right? It's not just about you come and help and the emotional component, but what you can get. Probably rephrasing Kennedy's JFK's quote. It's like, you have to ask what your country can do for you as well as a diasporan. Yeah. Right. So,
but this is where there's a bit of a challenge, because it actually, that challenge, which has economic roots, right, and foundation, actually made this whole conversation about diaspora mainstream. if we read Hachik Tololyan's, at least his 1996 paper, where he talks about how the origin of the diaspora and how it got inserted into public discourse and so on, he comes to a surprising conclusion that sort of, how did this even happen? Why did this happen? Because it used to be just a narrow topic, but it turned out that this connection between diaspora and the country of origin or homeland, or however we want to describe it, goes both ways, right? One is the economic development point, and that's welcomed, right? So as long as the money is coming in, things are fine. But the moment diaspora tries to acquire a certain individual standing in decision-making, that becomes a bit of a problem. So well-researched cases are cases of Mexico, where labor migrants are able to pull together because they come from the same village, and they're able to pull funds together and have a significant leverage over local authorities and so on. So that subconsciously could be a factor out there, or sort of implied factor in decision-making process. But again, perhaps I'm sure there is a way to work things out, and then have a diaspora.
That's why we are here, Alec.
I'm sorry?
That's why we are here, to kind of discuss and brainstorm what could be improved.
Yeah, with the balanced sort of participation from country and from the diaspora.
And diaspora.
And
yes, in fact, I'm sorry, Asbed, you mentioned something that, Asbed actually mentioned something that is very important, like the network, right? Like the connection. And many Armenians, based on, even if I, for instance, I've been guilty of this, I haven't been active participation in my own community. However, I'm more connected to Armenia through these digital platforms and contribute more to Armenia. So today, nowadays, like in today's world, you do not need to have these heavy duty institutions, you know, like traditional ones that you go to your community,
right.
Your community tells you how to contribute to Armenia, and you do your philanthropy or you do your business, you know, initiatives in Armenia. Now, the digital platforms, which I'm hoping that we will kind of later on talk about and start talking about what platforms do we need, really like helps to kind of overcome these issues, helps to kind of like this cut through connections, right? And directly connect to the country, to people, have a people-to-people connection and get things done. So that is an excellent point. We need this nowadays. It would be really stupid not to take advantage of those platforms in today's economy, in today's world.
Right.
Yeah, but I think that's the critical point here, because now it's so much easier than before to set up a fundraiser. Let's start with that, right? On Facebook, and then you have someone is really connecting with whatever, building a school, repairing roads, or whatever it might be, community project. And Armenians, again, are not alone in this. Other countries also have similar initiatives. The only difference is that in other countries, it's somewhat more, or not all of them, but in some of the examples, there's a bit more structure towards that. For example, again, if we look at the case of Moldova, which is new to the word diaspora, just like they found out about it 10, 15 years ago, that apparently those labor migrants working abroad could actually be connected with each other, and we can help them find each other. And once we help them find each other, we can actually figure out which villages they're from and talk to the villages, people in the villages, and ask them what they need, and then tell that to the migrants and put the two together. And then the money goes to this village to build a road, to school, and so on. There's what we're revolving around is one word: trust, right? And if there is trust, then there's going to be this meaningful connection. The problem with trust is that it requires time. In the absence of time, and with the diversity that we have, there needs to be transparency. And this is where digital platforms, and I'm not a programmer whatsoever, but I'm guessing if there is a way to transfer money and trust that we can trust, then there's probably a way to help people connect.
And one thing I want to just
quickly
add,
because we're running out of time.
I have one sentence, that is, this diversity we should not fear this diversity, but should actually welcome it, because eventually
I was going to just add a quote, perfect quote of that, being the nerd, Star Trek, the Trekkie I am, Vulcan philosophy. In Vulcan philosophy, there is a basic component that infinite combinations and infinite diversity in infinite combinations. And we should not be obsessed about creating a common identity. What is an Armenian? We have to celebrate that diversity, because with that diversity, we can create so many different options. We can create so many different opportunities. So diversity and diasporan diversity, within Armenia diversity, within diasporan's diversity, I think these are elements that we can build upon as well. We can utilize it as well.
There is only one comment to this. I agree. But you're in Yerevan. How many different events take place during the day around the same theme? Dozens, right? That was my impression. But what else is happening is that not necessarily there's a conversation between the groups that are organizing this. So diversity is fine, but as long as there's some link that sort of the atoms in your background aspect need to be connected.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So thank you so much for interesting discussion today. This was the first in the series of discussions, and I believe we touched some interesting and important topics regarding Armenia diaspora relationships. So for decades, Armenian diaspora has shown its empathy and engagement largely through philanthropy and remittances. I do believe that we've reached the limits of the current forms of homeland diaspora cooperation, where Armenia perceives diaspora largely as an extractive resource, while diaspora views Armenia, as you mentioned, as a destination for summer tourism, maybe some investments and some small projects, but largely staying away from countries' development processes. So as Alek and Asbed mentioned, we face many, many issues and challenges. We need to invent a new narrative with active roles assigned to all parties who are willing to participate and contribute, right? Not everyone in diaspora will. Our next discussion will be about transforming Armenia diaspora relationships and building a partnership based on mutualism and trust. Thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Enjoy the conversation, Alek.
All right, well, thank you everyone. Thank you, Yeva.
Thank you.
Okay, bye guys.
Bye.